There isn't much known for sure in Five Nights at Freddy's, but there are a few things that are either directly confirmed or have enough evidence that they're treated as confirmed by most of the fanbase. While some of these topics may still be debated, one that is generally taken as fact is that the FNAF 4 minigames where the crying child gets bitten by Fredbear take place at Fredbear's family diner. After all, the animatronics present are Fredbear and Spring Bonnie. The game takes place in the early 80s before most of the games except for the recent Secret of the Mimic, and Fredbear's was the predecessor to Freddy Fazbear's Pizza. However, just because something is widely believed, that doesn't mean it's necessarily true. And the more I've looked into the topic, things just haven't added up the way they should. From the route between the crying child's home and the restaurant, to the connections Secret of the Mimic has to Fredbear's in the events of FNAF 4, to the animatronic the crying child is implied to possess, to the very year the game takes place, I've become increasingly convinced that the crying child wasn't bitten at Fredbear's family diner. Instead, I think the bite of 83 happened at one of the first Freddy Fazbear's pizzas, and I have the evidence to prove it. To set the stage, since most of the games I'm going to be pulling information from are multiple years old at this point, I think it's a good idea to give a refresher on the relevant games and the information we have from them before I get into the meat of why I'm attempting to overturn one of the most widely agreed upon pieces of lore in franchise history. Technically speaking, we see Fredbear for the first time in FNAF 1, though at this point in the timeline, the character is known as Golden Freddy due to having been modified and having his accessories altered a bit in the time since the character was in his original Fredbear form. However, the first mention of the name Fredbear itself, or Fredbear's Family Diner, came in Five Nights at Freddy's 2, where after the incident that is heavily implied to be William Afton going for round 2 of murders at Freddy's during the day shift, the phone guy mentions that they're trying to get in contact with the owner of the original restaurant, which he thinks is called Fredbear's Family Diner, though the restaurant has been closed for years and he doesn't think they'll be able to track anyone down. While FNAF 3 doesn't mention Fredbear's directly, an old recording of Phone Guy does mention Fredbear himself as one of 2 Springlock animatronic suits that, along with Spring Bonnie, was used at the Freddy Fazbear's Pizza he worked at up until multiple simultaneous Springlock failures at a sister location led to them no longer being used. The Springlock suits doubled as animatronics and costumes, with Springlocks being wound to hold the animatronic parts to the sides of the suits for a human performer to fit inside. However, the Springlocks weren't the most stable, and if they failed, the metal parts would return to their original positions regardless of whether or not there was still a person in there, which we see happen to William Afton in the end of night minigames after he gets into the Spring Bonnie suit. Then we get to FNAF 4, which comes in 2 parts. One part has us play as a crying child in the year 1983, who hears his Fredbear plushie talking to him and is bullied by his older brother for being scared of animatronics, despite liking plushies of Fredbear and the Freddy's characters. The crying child lives within walking distance of a restaurant where Fredbear and Spring Bonnie Springlock suits were in use, and a picture of Fredbear is on the wall of the restaurant, though there is a TV show and plenty of toys and other merch that depict the main Freddy's game as well. This part of the story comes to a head on the crying child's birthday, when the older brother and his friends, all wearing masks of the Freddy's characters, put the crying child in the mouth of the Fredbear animatronic, which happens to bite down, leading to what's known as the bite of 83 and the crying child later flatlining in the hospital. The other part is a bit more complicated, but based on the FNAF 1 phone call audio and the ambiance, the random hospital equipment, medication and flowers that can appear, the map and sister location, the Tales from the Pizzaplex books, and the Phone Guy interactive novel, the main nights of FNAF 4 are the crying child haunting his older brother Michael Afton, who is a security guard at Freddy's in FNAF 1, by sharing his memories with him. Part of that is presumably in the form of the 8-bit minigames, but during the main nights, Michael is forced to take the role of his little brother facing down nightmarish versions of the Freddy's animatronics. It turns out, William Afton was always an awful parent, because in the underground facility that would eventually become the setting of Sister Location, he set up these rooms to experiment with fear in children by making them face nightmarish situations by pumping the rooms full of nightmare hallucination gas. While the Tales from the Pizzaplex books have a random kid named Rory be the one who experiences the experiments, the fact that the Tales books aren't in the game continuity, how a similar instance of a random character taking the place of the player character in FNAF 3 happens in the Fazbear Frights books, and other things I go over in a previous video more specifically dedicated to Midnight Motorist, it seems like the victim of the nightmare experiments in the game timeline was the crying child, which likely factored into his fear of the animatronics that we see in the 8-bit minigames. This is backed up by Sister Location, which not only has a map that shows the bunkers connected to each of the locations from FNAF 4, but in the private room there's a Fredbear plushie with what looks like a walkie-talkie, as well as cameras that show the FNAF 4 rooms when the code 1983 is put into the pin pad, showing how William ran and monitored the nightmare experiments from there. The next game is Pizzeria Simulator, and the main thing of note in the game itself are 2 of the minigames. One of them is the security puppet minigame, which takes place on a rainy night, and in conjunction with the similar minigame in FNAF 2, shows how William Afton's first victim, Charlie Emily, died and possessed the puppet animatronic after being locked outside of Freddy's. While there are theories that she wasn't his first victim, considering how she was mentioned as the first victim in both the novel trilogy and the FNAF 2 movie trailer, and how her father in the games claims that he was the first one wounded by William's actions that ended up with the other kids getting killed, I'm inclined to believe she is the first in the games as well. We also know it was probably Freddy specifically, since the character shown in the FNAF 2 version of the minigame has a black, not purple hat and bow tie and is labeled Freddy in the files, and a recently released activity kit talks about how at Freddy's there were wristbands were given to the kids as a souvenir and a way to track them, with a black light drawing of Charlie from the security puppet minigame where she's wearing a wristband to signal to the puppet puppet to keep her in the building, implying that Freddy's giving the kids wristbands is connected to why Charlie has a wristband. Charlie then got trapped outside, William drove up, killed her and drove away, and the puppet made it to her body but collapsed on it due to the rain. This minigame presumably connects to the lore portion of the Midnight Motorist minigame, which takes place on a rainy night and is labeled later that night in the files. We drive home in the rain as a character that is heavily implied to be William Afton, both via his purple car, how the upcoming 5 Laps at Freddy's game has a vehicle called the Midnight Motor with a yellow rabbit antenna, and some other things that I go into more detail about in my Midnight Motorist video. On his way home, he can stop in a clearing that has a weird dirt pile looking thing, and at a building labeled Juniors. If he approaches Juniors, the green character outside tells him he knows he can't be there and to not make this more difficult than it needs to be. Once William reaches his home, going inside reveals a character wearing gray watching TV who tells William to leave some other him alone because he had a rough day, only for William to not do that, and head to his son's room and demand entry. When the door is locked and won't open, William goes outside to try and get in through the window, only to find it broken, with a trail of footprints leading away from it. A pair of 3-toed footprints is visible near a bush, and while William doesn't acknowledge them, he says, "Ran off to that place again. He will be sorry when he gets back." After Pizzeria Simulator comes Help Wanted. There are a few neat lore confirmations here, such as the Faz tokens that confirm Freddy's has been around since 1983, as well as DLC where there's an alternate hub world with a large banner that says Fall Fest 83 and shows a house up on a hill that looks suspiciously similar to the house shown on the FNAF 4 menu screen. Help Wanted also teases the game's security breach by showing its location, the Pizzaplex, under construction. However, what the teaser doesn't show, but Security Breach itself does, is that the Pizzaplex was built on top of a sinkhole containing a few weird things, including but not limited to a giant Freddy head, the FNAF 6 pizzeria, and an area deeper underground containing a giant old computer labeled mixes, a hostile endoskeleton called the Mimic, and some old fabric costumes that aren't Freddy's related. Help Wanted 2 doesn't go into this too much more, though it does take place in the Pizzeria Simulator location, and has a somewhat notable ending involving playing a VR version of the arcade game that randomly has the sister location elevator in it, which is interesting. However, the next game, Secret of the Mimic, is where things get extra interesting. Set at the earliest point we have in the FNAF timeline, in the year 1979, Fredbear's Family Diner and Chica's Party World are the only Fazbear-related locations that we're aware of being open at the time, with the Freddy Fazbear's Pizza chain being planned to open later. We play as Arnold, a Fazbear technician sent to get the Mimic from Murray's Costume Manor, a former contractor that Fazbear Entertainment acquired. MCM was owned by Edwin Murray, the Mimic's creator, and after the death of his wife and son, Edwin lashed out and the Mimic, specifically the M2 variant, imitated and absorbed his rage, leading to it killing anyone who entered the building. While exploring, there are a few interesting discoveries that can be made. For example, there are messages from characters in the game that you can collect that indicate William was actively poaching Edwin's employees to drive him out of business and acquire his property, including the land his home was built on. Though it wasn't just poaching the employees that damaged Edwin's financial stability. Edwin was banking his ability to recover on the success of the Fazbear project he was contracted to help with, which we see in the games as a prototype of the FNAF 1 location, which interestingly has a giant Freddy head outside of it and contains a machine that looks like Mix's, though this one is primarily active as the original Mimic program M1 and is labeled F10N4 since it copied Fiona, Edwin's wife. The prototype Freddy's and MCM are also connected to the Murray household through a series of tunnels, which is an interesting construction choice, and the house itself gets even more interesting in how it holds some of the costumes that show up in the Mimic's area of ruin, and has a bedroom that has toys from and overall looks suspiciously similar to the FNAF 4 bedroom that shows up on the sister location cameras, though with a different layout. And speaking of bedrooms, if you're interested in getting better sleep, you should check out the sponsor of this video, Manta Sleep. Manta Sleep has a variety of comfortable sleep masks with adjustable straps and eye cups that also completely block out the light without pressing on your eyes. So if you're like me and have roommates who have different sleep schedules than you do, or get woken up earlier than you'd like by the sun, or want to catch up on sleep during the day, you can comfortably sleep without having to worry about the lights turning on or coming in from the window and waking you up. I personally have the Manta Pro Sleep Mask, which is engineered for side sleepers through C-shaped eye cups, and the Manta Sound Sleep Mask, which also has the C-shaped eye cups but also has built-in razor-thin Bluetooth speakers that don't take away from the comfort of the mask and make it so that I can listen to music to fall asleep without bothering my roommates. Having used one of the two masks basically daily for a really long time at this point, I genuinely recommend them if you're looking for good quality sleep masks, and not only can you get them for 10% off using the link in the description, pinned comment, and on-screen QR code, or using code IDsFantasy, but from now through November 27th, everything on the site is 15% off and comes with a free holiday recharge kit. So if you've been holding out on upgrading your sleep experience, now is the time to check it out. Anyway, in addition to the information from the games, there's something else that I need to address for context, and that is the franchise guidebooks. There have been points where the series guidebooks either suggest things are possible that quite literally aren't, say things happened that didn't, or otherwise mess up details about the series. For example, the Ultimate Guide says that sister location takes place at Circus Baby's Pizza World instead of Entertainment and Rentals, and that Bone Dude in FNAF 3 says that FNAF 3 takes place 30 years after the last Freddy's closed, even though he never actually said that, and a page before the book said we don't know what event FNAF 3 is 30 years after. I bring this up because in the Character Encyclopedia, we get two seemingly contradictory pieces of information. While the Crying Child's page says that the restaurant was Fredbear's Family Diner, the locations page says, in in reference to the FNAF 4 bedroom that it's where a child is haunted by terrible memories of a visit to Freddy Fazbear's Pizza. Considering I doubt that the FNAF 4 minigames could have taken place at both Fredbear's and Freddy's, and how the guidebooks aren't the most reliable, I'm not going to use this information as evidence one way or the other. Another book-related thing I should mention is the interactive novel The Week Before, which is set the week before FNAF 1, when Phone Guy was working security at Freddy's. In the book, the bite of 83 is brought up if you, as Phone Guy, choose to call 1983 on the phone. And the book mentions that while he doesn't remember when the first Freddy's opened or when Fredbear's did, one year that stuck out was 1983, which was known as the year of the big bite up until a bite happened again in 1987. Calling the number leads to him hearing the events of the bite of 83 and then getting bitten himself after the sound of crying continues after the call's end. Not only does this strengthen the idea that the crying child's spirit is present at Freddy's, likely in the Golden Freddy suit since it used to be Fredbear, but I find it notable that while Fredbear's Family Diner is mentioned, it's not to say that the bite took place there, and Freddy's is mentioned in the same way in the same sentence. And this connects to the reason why I started considering this theory in the first place. After all, it's pretty widely accepted in the FNAF community that the crying child is one of the spirits in Golden Freddy that was present at the FNAF 1 location, and that's something The Week Before backs up with this scene, and that I go into more depth about in a previous video I'll have linked in the description if you want to check it out. We do know from FNAF 3 that Fredbear and Spring Bonnie were used at Freddy's location, since Phone Guy himself records training tapes for using them, but one thing that's bothered me for a while was why the crying child would possess the Freddy's version of Fredbear in the first place if he was bitten by and presumably possessed the Fredbear at Fredbear's Family Diner. At first I thought that maybe Fredbear just got moved to Freddy's after Fredbear's closed, but then there was the issue of Freddy's opening for the first time in 1983, the same year that FNAF 4 took place. If Freddy's was open simultaneously with Fredbear's, and Fredbear and Spring Bonnie were used at both, why wouldn't they both have their own Fredbears even if Fredbear's Family Diner eventually shut down? It's not impossible that Fredbear got moved after, of course, but it got me thinking, what if the crying child got bitten at Freddy's instead? Freddy's was open for the first time the year that FNAF 4 takes place after all, and if this was a Freddy's, that could potentially explain not only why he would possess the same Fredbear that went on to become Golden Freddy, but also why there's so much Freddy's merch around, including the bullies' masks. Not to mention, if the Freddy's franchise just started, it makes a lot of sense that William would be spending more time at and hosting his kid's birthday party at a Freddy's instead of the diner that Freddy's is meant to replace. We do have a teaser for FNAF 4 that shows Fredbear's hat and bow tie along with faded text that lines up best with Fredbear's Family Diner, which seems to imply that the Fredbear in FNAF 4 was the one at Fredbear's, but the source code for the teaser didn't say 1983. It said 1982, the year before Freddy's opened. So what if it was property of Fredbear's in 1982, only to become property of Freddy's in 1983? While this isn't the strongest evidence on its own, with what we know and can otherwise theorize about the Afton house and its proximity to other locations in the games, it would actually line up painfully well. While the FNAF minigames are often simplified in terms of scale, as well as what areas and objects are and aren't shown for the sake of the 8-bit style and locked camera, we do know from the FNAF 4 minigames that the restaurant is within walking distance of the crying child's home, and that the general route he takes is from the restaurant towards the road, turning to his right to continue along the sidewalk by the road, and then right again to go up to his house. And interestingly, this route is pretty much identical to the one we see in Midnight Motorist from Junior's to the Afton house, though the direction of the doors is altered to accommodate the differing camera angle. And while William does drive from Junior's to his home, it's not only a pretty short drive, but there are footprints leading away from the house in the direction of Junior's. The only other thing in that direction is the dirt pile, which is even farther away, so regardless of which one you think the kid is going to, Junior's is presumably within walking distance. Considering the minigame is labeled later that night and has reigned like the security puppet minigame, I personally think this makes a lot of sense to be later in the night after Charlie was killed, with Junior's being the Freddy's location she was killed at, and William arriving at Junior's is him driving back from wherever he was going in the first place when he stopped to kill Charlie. While some have suggested that Junior's is a bar and the green guy is a bouncer, the proximity to the Afton house and connections to the security puppet minigame gives me the impression that it's meant to be the same location as the FNAF 4 restaurant. And wouldn't you know it, but with Freddy's coming after Fredbear's, that would make Freddy's the junior location to Fredbear's Family Diner. The green guy could potentially be bouncer-type character, since based on one of the promotional images for the original FNAF movie, Freddy's did serve beer, though presumably not to the children, I hope. Or he could be telling William that he has to stay out because there's an active police investigation going on into what happened to Charlie. And it should be pretty obvious to William that he shouldn't be tampering with the crime scene. And even then, Freddy's being a junior location to Fredbear's still isn't as far as the evidence goes. Though, real quick first, if you made it this far in the video, you're probably at least somewhat interested in the stuff I cover, so consider subscribing and turning the video notifications on so YouTube will know to show you my content when it comes out. My upload schedule's a bit irregular, so that's the best way to know when I upload, and I've got some fun stuff planned going forward. Anyway, to explain just how far the evidence goes, I first have to talk about how a whole lot of Freddy's construction seemed to happen in the exact same spot. Remember when I mentioned that there was a giant Freddy head and MCM costumes under the Pizzaplex and security breach, not to mention Mexes in the Mimic? While the Freddy head under the Pizzaplex doesn't look identical, it's similar enough to be reminiscent, especially when combined with the whole finding an extra Freddy's under a building that's not supposed to have one there thing. And with there being so many other similar objects and entities down there, not to mention the tunnels and elevator during the Mimic chase, that makes it seem really likely that not only was the Pizzaplex built on top of the FNAF 6 pizzeria, but that same location is where Murray's Costume Manor used to be. We do know from Secret of the Mimic that after Edwin fell into financial ruin, William ended up with possession of the property, both for the Costume Manor and for the land Edwin's family home was built on, though he assured Edwin that he wouldn't touch the house. We'll be coming back to that later, but that would explain how Fazbear Entertainment would have the ability to build over that property. Not only that, but it seems incredibly likely that the FNAF 6 location and the tunnels underneath the building are connected to sister location. The underground rooms and tunnel system, both in MCM and the underground of the FNAF 6 pizzeria, are reminiscent of Circus Babies, especially considering the Scooper ending of Ruin and Help Wanted 2. Help Wanted 2 takes place in the FNAF 6 location under the Pizzaplex, and while the Vanny mask the player character wears distorts their perception, I find it incredibly suspicious that part of beating the Princess Quest 4 game in Help Wanted 2 involves taking the sister location elevator. Due to the mask, the exact appearance isn't going to be true to life, but either way, it's an interesting detail to include considering the breaker room map in sister location. On that map, there are little squares depicting animatronic locations, including the ones in Circus Babies Entertainment and Rental, but also in both of the Nightmare Experiment Chambers, and more importantly, in one building with 2 dots that's in turn connected to a set of 4 rooms that have the exact layout of the Afton house in the FNAF 4 minigames. So since the other 2 areas are underground experiment chambers based on Tales from the Pizzaplex, sister location is connected to the FNAF 4 restaurant. And while these connection symbols could be the path the crying child took, the fact that they're included on this map implies to me that they're meant to represent tunnels considered to be part of Circus Babies, just like some of the other symbols on the map. And if that's the case, not only would that mean the FNAF 4 restaurant is built in the same spot as Murray's Costume Manor, but that the tunnels connecting to the Murray house in Secret of the Mimic are now represented on the map by markings connecting to the Afton house. Remember how earlier I mentioned that the house on the hill in Curse of Dreadbear looks identical to the main menu screen of FNAF 4, with both games being connected to the year 1983? To me, this gives the impression that the house on the hill is the one the Aftons were living in during the events of FNAF 4. And interestingly enough, in Secret of the Mimic, the title screen of the game shows Edwin's old house at the top of a hill overlooking Murray's Costume Manor. And we have a note from William saying that of course he isn't going to touch Edwin's home, except then Edwin goes missing. And Edwin's son's room looks to be the inspiration for the Nightmare Experiment room. And in one of the endings, things start burning down, and well, William owns the land, doesn't he? So why not build a new home and a new restaurant where the old ones used to be, and put his new Nightmare Experiment and dangerous animatronic storage and rental facility in the underground research and development area? He owns that now too, after all. And if he did build a new restaurant over where MCM used to be, I don't think it would have been a Fredbear's. Fredbear's Family Diner was a small single location that we know for a fact already existed elsewhere at the time, and it wouldn't make sense to build another Fredbear's when there were already plans to start a brand new restaurant chain that had a prototype under that very building. A new restaurant chain that was set to open in the year 1983 and feature not just Fredbear and Spring Bonnie, but other animatronic characters that there would have to be merch for. A restaurant chain he would be personally involved with running, so why not move closer to where one of its first locations would be? One where his son would get bitten by Fredbear the year the franchise started, and go on to possess the animatronic, only to be joined by another spirit later on and become Golden Freddy. A new restaurant that would be one of the first Freddy Fazbear's pizza places. For all I know, there's a piece of evidence I overlooked that can't be interpreted to work with the location being Freddy's, but the more time goes on, and the more evidence I see, the more I'm convinced that this has to be the case and that it's something the games have been trying to tell us for years. Why have the road in Midnight Motorist between Junior's and the house mapped so well with FNAF 4 unless Junior's is referring to the Junior location to Fredbear's? Why have so much Freddy's merch involved with the FNAF 4 location in the year Freddy's opened? Why have Golden Freddy seem to have both the crying child and a missing kid's soul? Why imply that the Pizzaplex is on top of a Freddy's on top of sister location that all used to be Murray's Costume Manor, and that the FNAF 4 house is where the Murray house used to be, unless the Afton house and one of the first Freddy's locations were opened in these locations? The creator of the franchise, Scott Cawthon, has mentioned that he tries to correct things missed in previous games in the subsequent ones that come out. Meanwhile, almost every single game, except for Ultimate Custom Night, the mobile game, and Into the Pit, seem to be pointing in this direction, and I think that's because Scott has been trying to tell us we missed something. Would it make it weird that Fredbear's is mentioned and never shown? Maybe, but the franchise is Five Nights at Freddy's, and if this is the case, it would make it so every FNAF game either takes place in a Freddy's, a place that becomes a Freddy's, or in a location directly connected to Freddy's via whatever sister location has going on, and I think that's pretty fitting, all things considered. I know it's probably not going to be the most popular idea, and for all I know, there's something out there that I missed that throws everything out the window, but with the information I'm currently aware of, this is probably one of the theories I'm most confident in. And hey, even if it's not correct, sometimes it can be good to try and consider other possibilities. I hope this video at least helped you do that, even if you still disagreed, and if you enjoyed the video, consider sharing it with other FNAF fans you know to see what they think about it. But with all that said, don't forget to check out Mantis Sleep for their 15% site-wide discount and free recharge kit through November 27th and 10% off via the code IDsFantasy or the links in the pinned comment description and QR code. Don't get stabbed and have a nice day.